What's up? I'm Troubleshoot. Welcome back to another video. In this quick guide, I'll be showing you how you can optimize Baldur's Gate 3 for the best possible performance and of course visuals. That is a very important thing with this game. It's not too demanding for what it is, so you can make it look even better without losing too many FPS and in fact even making a bit. Without further ado, this video is not going to cover optimizing Windows pretty much at all. Instead, in the description down below, you'll find a Windows 10, 11 and NVIDIA optimization guides to get even more out of your PC. Instead, we'll just be diving right into the game. Now, it doesn't really matter what platform you have this game on. The in-game settings are the same for all of them. For me, I have this on GOG, Good Old Games. They gave me a key to this probably about a year ago now, but I just never got around to it. So a huge shout out to them. I'll have a link to the GOG store down below. I don't think I have my affiliate link anymore, but anyways, we'll fire up the game itself and get to optimizing it for the best performance. On the main launcher, you'll have the option between DirectX 11 and Vulkan. Your performance may vary between these. Usually whatever's selected as the default is the best, and in this case it's DirectX 11. You can try Vulkan if you're on AMD, or with your current option set, whatever it may be, you may find that Vulkan is more performant for you. Choosing between these two really depends on what your system is and how it fares with the game itself. We'll fire it up, and of course you may notice the first time upon launching this, you'll be prompted to update your graphics driver. If you are, head across to your graphics driver distributor's website and download the latest update. Upon firing up the game, head across to the options section, and inside of here we can get to customizing. So first of all, at the very top, head across to the video tab, and in here we have some very basic options. Obviously, select the graphics card that you'll be playing your game on. If you're on a laptop or a computer with multiple graphics cards, you'll likely see an integrated GPU and your actual gaming GPU. Select the most powerful one in your system, and you're off to the races. Display monitor, aspect ratio should match whatever your display is, and resolution. Now, if you find that you're losing FPS and you're trying to claw it back, changing the resolution here isn't the best option. Instead, set this to your native display resolution, or at least a compatible one, otherwise your game will be needlessly blurry. The refresh rate should absolutely match the highest possible or best refresh rate for your monitor. Once again, this depends on your monitor. You won't be able to change this depending on your display mode. Instead, make sure you have full screen selected here. When you do so, you'll be able to customize the refresh rate right above. Just a quick note, this game doesn't have a built-in FPS counter. Instead, you'll need to use something like MSI Afterburner, or of course the Steam overlay to get an FPS counter in the corner. Looking down further, VSync, this should absolutely be disabled at all points unless you're getting a really bad screen tearing where the top and the bottom half of your monitor don't seem to match up, as in the example on the right hand side. The same goes for your frame rate cap. You'll usually want this enabled later on and cap to something slightly less than what FPS you're getting in game, but for now leave this unticked as we'll be comparing our FPS when we're actually in the game. The maximum frame rate can only be customized when the frame rate cap is on, and after this optimization guide, I'd highly recommend capping your FPS to a little bit below what you're getting at the maximum point. That way there'll be a tiny bit left for the rest of your PC to use. This could be especially important if you're recording with something like OBS and your streams or recordings are lagging. Scrolling down, we have a gamma correction section where you can change the brightness of your game if it's too dark, and scrolling down further, quality. Now, the default preset that is picked for you is probably actually really good. If it's set to the higher end, you may want to set down to medium and see what kind of performance difference you're getting. At the medium default settings here, the performance is actually really good, especially for higher end graphics cards. And of course, on lower end, you may want to choose one of the lower options, such as low. For now, I'll leave it on medium. For a game that looks actually really good and performs just as well, you can leave most of these settings where they are, except for texture filtering, which you can actually raise, as it's usually a very cheap operation to do on modern graphics cards, while it'll make textures in-game look a lot better. The animation level of detail can also be cranked up, usually for very little performance impact, but it can actually raise the quality of the game quite a bit. The slow HDD mode should only be used when you have a really slow hard drive instead of playing it off an SSD. This will use more RAM and VRAM, as it'll load more textures and things like that into memory. That way it doesn't need to fetch them at a very slow rate from your slow hard drive. Dynamic crowds you can leave on unless you're getting really bad CPU performance that's dragging down your entire game. Now, that being said, obviously not everyone has a super powerful graphics card and you may need to lower some of these options. So, the most important options in this general section for FPS will be model quality, detail distance, instance distance, and texture quality. The last one here, texture quality, this option will mainly impact your VRAM usage. The higher this option, the more VRAM you need. This game isn't too demanding when it comes to textures, so having this on medium on a 4GB VRAM graphics card is probably pretty good. You can of course lower this to see what kind of performance you're getting. On much higher end graphics cards you can raise this and it'll definitely add to the crispness of the game, as you can see in the preview images on the far right, but we can get that through other means, which I'll show you in a bit, and may even save us some FPS along the way. Scrolling down further to lighting, this section is very simple. The shadow quality you'll want to crank down, as that'll greatly improve your performance with very minimal visual impact. Cloud and fog you can both leave on medium, as they'll have very little performance impact. Maybe fog you'd want to crank down, but it shouldn't really affect your visibility in game. Fog is where fog is. Scrolling down to post-processing, this is where things get really interesting. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card and you have the DLSS option available, I'd recommend using this over AMD FSR. Both of these options here essentially render your game at a lower resolution and crank up the quality or perceived quality using artificial intelligence. NVIDIA DLSS is designed specifically for NVIDIA graphics cards. However, AMD FSR is compatible with all graphics cards, not just AMD and even NVIDIA. As you can see, scrolling between these two options, the DLSS option is usually much shinier, as you can see in these screenshots here, but for the most part, the quality that you gain with these options is good and I'd recommend using it anyway. For NVIDIA DLSS, I'd recommend choosing quality if you have a really high-end graphics card, otherwise maybe balanced. Essentially, the lower on this list you push this option to the more performance versus quality side, the lower your in-game resolution will be, causing your graphics card to really be able to push out some super high FPS. It'll use artificial intelligence to its best ability to crank up that lower quality, but after a certain point you'll notice some very bad visual artifacts that may be distracting at a certain point. Having this on balanced or quality is probably what you'd like. If you have a high-end graphics card, leave this on quality and forget about it. For AMD FSR, a good place to start is quality. On super high-end graphics cards, you can crank this up to ultra quality, though you'll notice a very small impact, but it definitely is noticeable, as you can see on the far right hand side, especially with the rock texture, pretty much comparable with pushing up the texture quality above, but it doesn't actually cost anything in terms of VRAM. Obviously, the further you push that down, the more visual artifacts, but the more FPS you'll be getting as well. Assuming you don't use DLSS or AMD FSR for that matter, we can push things the other way around. We can render the game at native resolution, but instead we can use FidelityFX Sharpening. This will increase the sharpness of pretty much everything on your screen, making textures and things like that really pop and look super good. Then you'll have a sharpness slider right below this, where we can adjust just how sharp in-game graphics are. But using a DLSS and AMD FSR for that matter basically add their own sharpening filters and things like that, so you definitely don't need to worry about the FidelityFX Sharpening. However, we do still have the sharpness slider enabled when we're using either of these options. Usually for DLSS, I'd recommend keeping this at about a third of the way up, and for AMD FSR, maybe about halfway or a little bit less. For me, I'll leave it right down here. Then anti-aliasing, I'd highly recommend having this off completely, especially if you're using any kind of upscaling like DLSS or AMD FSR. This will needlessly take away your performance and make the game more blurry just to get rid of jagged edges on objects. Using DLSS or FSR will completely negate the need to use anti-aliasing pretty much at all. Ambient occlusion is a cheap way of adding more depth to objects. You can leave this on. It's not too costly for performance. Depth of field, this is mainly your preference and shouldn't really have too much of an in-game impact. You can disable this completely if you like feeling that you don't need glasses. However, if you were to have this enabled, you have previews on the far right hand side, as well as the quality of the depth of field. I definitely usually have this off, as I like seeing what's going on, but it's your preference entirely. Then finally, God Rays Bloom. These two options are also your preference. They really add to the graphic quality of the game without too much cost at all, and I'd highly recommend leaving both of these turned on. These are both relatively cheap effects, and even though it does say rays, it's not ray tracing. Finally, subsurface scattering. This has a very minor impact on lighting in game, as you can see on the lower mushrooms to the left hand side there. Usually you can leave this off or on. You'll barely notice the difference between the two, but the performance will slightly drop when this is enabled. And with that, that's really about it. Just keep in mind when you're scrolling up and down this here, should you be using your mouse wheel, whenever you hover over one of these and scroll, sometimes it'll change, such as this here. Very odd, but anyways. Everything else is your preference. The audio tab at the very top, dynamic range. If you have this set too high, there'll be a big difference between loud and soft noises. You can turn this down should you want explosions and things like that to not be so jarring. In the advanced section of audio, we have occlusion quality, which is essentially how audio muffles when it goes behind other objects. This is usually a pretty cheap effect, so leaving it on high is probably good, unless you're really CPU limited, running on a super low-end CPU system, in which case you can crank this down for some more performance. And with that, we're pretty much done with the options here. From here, we can dive into the actual game itself. The only thing I'd recommend playing around with really is the DLSS or AMD FSR quality when you're in game to see which one you prefer best for performance and of course visual fidelity. Anyways, that's really about it for this super quick guide. Thank you all for watching. My name's been Troubleshoot, and I'll see you all next time. Ciao!